Good evening. Welcome. I'm Christine Shin, the Dean of the School of International Service. After an absence of 2 years, it is my great pleasure this evening to welcome you in person and virtually on behalf of the Ignatius family. The majority of you are joining us virtually from all over the country. Thank you. My special thanks to Paul Ignatius, his daughter Sarah, and friends of the family for joining us tonight in person and on Zoom. I'm deeply appreciative of your continuing commitment to SIS. The annual Nancy Weiser Ignatius Lecture on the Environment features senior policymakers and leaders in the nonprofit, public, and private sectors who work tirelessly to address environmental challenges here at home and all over the world. Tonight, I'm so very pleased to welcome the highly accomplished Sherri Goodman as the keynote speaker for the 5th annual lecture. In a little bit, you will learn more of Sherri's distinguished career in service to humanity on this planet. And you'll find that her remarks integrate nicely the career and service of Nancy and Paul Ignatius. It is a beautiful and uplifting way for us to resume this lecture series. Sherri, welcome to SIS, and thank you for taking the time to share with us this evening your perspective on the role that the military and security play in advancing environmental protection and sustainability. We look forward to your remarks. Before we begin our program, I would like to take a moment to honor the life and legacy of this lecture's namesake, the late Nancy Weiser Ignatius. Nancy, or Nan as we affectionately called her, earned her master's degree in international affairs from the School of International Service in 1969 and was a dedicated member of the SIS alumni community until her passing in 2019. Throughout her life, Nan was intellectually curious, kind, and generous to those around her and determined to make a positive difference in the world. She was a pioneering visionary activist who championed environmental causes long before they became mainstream practices. In the 1970s, Nan co-founded Concern Incorporated, an all-female volunteer organization that informed and empowered consumers to make environmentally conscious shopping decisions. Through its advocacy, Concern Inc. leveraged consumer power to pressure manufacturers into adopting more sustainable product packaging practices, something we take for granted very much today. Following her success at Concern Inc., Nan began working at the Department of Energy, where she launched the first solar energy exhibit in 1976 on a section of the National Mall. Later, she would work for the Environmental Protection Agency. In addition to her environmental advocacy, Nan was deeply involved in the Washington National Cathedral, where the Nancy and Paul Ignatius program was established to honor the couple's lifetime of service, as well as their personal commitment to exploring and addressing humanity's most challenging questions. Nan's life exemplified the ideals of service that are central to the mission of SIS. Her legacy lives on in her husband, Paul, who has become a dear friend to SIS, in her children, Adi, Sarah, David, and Amy, her grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, in the continued impact of her work around local global inquiry and environmental activism, and here at SIS, in the Nancy Weiser Ignatius Lecture on the Environment. Through the generosity of the Ignatius family, the annual lecture series continues to engage SIS community members and friends with the core environmental challenges facing the world today. We look forward to yet another meaningful conversation this evening. Before I step away, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Simon Nicholson, who will open this evening's lecture. Simon is an associate professor of international relations here in SIS. His work focuses on environmental governance, global food politics, and the politics of emerging technologies, including climate engineering. technologies. He is co-founder of two initiatives here at the school, focused respectively on climate engineering and carbon removal. And Simon plays a key role in bringing this special lecture to life each year. So thank you, and please welcome Professor Simon Nichols.
Thank you, Christine. Hi, everybody. Zoom is miraculous. It's great that lots of people can join us online. But I do have to say there's something special about being in a room together. It's fabulous, Sherri, to welcome you here. And Paul and Sarah, welcome back to the SAS building. Your vision brings us together in this fashion, and we thank you. Sherri, I've got to read the condensed version of your bio so we can get straight to your remarks. Sherri Goodman is Senior Fellow at the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program and also the Polar Institute. Among numerous past roles, Sherri served as the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense focused on environmental security from 1993 to 2001. Sherri, through multiple roles and multiple engagements, is credited with educating a generation of US military and government officials about the nexus between climate change and national security, using her famous coinage threat multiplier. Is that really yours? Yeah. Which we all use all the time, right? This coinage threat multiplier to fundamentally reshape the national discourse on the topic. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine scrambles energy markets and food markets across the world, and the week after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change just dropped their most recent report warning us of the threats associated with not acting on climate change, it feels like you're just the right person to have with us this evening, Sherri. Sherri's remarks will be followed by a conversation with my colleague, Rob Kelley. Rob is assistant professor here in SAS, an expert on global citizenship and public diplomacy. The event is being live streamed. We will post a version of this that can be shared after the fact. Please join me in welcoming Sherri Goodman.
Thank you very much, Simon. And thank you, Secretary Ignatius, Sarah, Dean Chen. It's really a deep pleasure and a deep honor to be here with you today. I'm very honored to deliver the Nancy Weiser Ignatius Lecture and to follow in the footsteps of the prior speakers, including Bill McKibben, Secretary Ernie Moniz, and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, among others. Nancy and Paul Ignatius together and individually share many of my own passions and goals. Okay, is that better? Okay. Like Paul, I started out in the field of national security and public service. And like Nancy, I've worked on often overlooked environmental concerns. Indeed, the very description of this lecture, leaders who champion environmental causes before they are mainstream, perfectly captures my own life experience. Although I didn't get quite as far as Paul, who served as Secretary of the Navy, I served in a version of the Assistant Secretary of Defense job he had. He had the title Assistant Secretary of Defense Installations and Logistics. And when I held this portfolio in the 1990s, it was called Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, Environmental Security, a title that many did not understand at the time. Like Paul, I am the child of immigrants. Paul's parents came from Armenia, mine from Germany. My parents arrived in this country as young children in the 1930s, among the few German Jews able to escape the horrors of the Holocaust. Most were not so fortunate. And that awareness and the ever-present shadow of those who didn't make it became part of the ethos that pushed my siblings and me to be grateful for being part of the American dream and to hold our nation and ourselves to a high standard of integrity and achievement. Our calling and our faith compels us to make the world a better place through our life's work. Paul and Nancy's life exemplifies that ethos as well. I am deeply grateful to both of them for their service, dedication to the natural world, and devotion to our nation. Nancy's own experience creating an environmental organization called Concern, which developed eco tips for informed consumers, was her way of advancing environmental awareness during the dawn of the consumer advocacy era. I'm deeply grateful for her leadership that paved the way for women of my generation to further advance in what had previously been male-dominated fields, such as national defense. So my own college experience at Amherst in the late 1970s and 1980s, at a time when doors were just opening to women in many fields, gave me the courage and confidence to launch my career in the field of national security, and later to forge a new focus on environmental security. My career closely parallels America's historic evolution from the Cold War to the climate era, and now into a new combined Cold War by Putin amidst the climate's hot wager. In this wonky world, I am best known for coining the phrase threat multiplier to characterize the impact of climate change on national security. I'm going to tell you that story today. But first, I'm going to tell you about a time earlier in my career when I was known as the bomb lady. My own college thesis focused on, because we do have some college or recent college students here in this audience, I focused on the controversy in NATO over the neutron bomb, an episode in American foreign policy that Paul undoubtedly remembers. I examined the technological and political motives for the Carter administration's attempt to deploy a low-yield tactical nuclear weapon known as the neutron bomb in Europe in the late 1970s, and why this effort was rejected by key NATO allies, Germany and the UK. The neutron bomb became known as the weapon that kills people and leaves buildings standing. Given the conflict in Ukraine today, it's absolutely clear why European capitals did not want a nuclear weapon with a lower threshold of use. It's hard to believe now, and for all the millennials, Gen Xers in the room today, I wrote every sentence of my 200-page plus thesis by longhand. Probably some of you writers here in the room did too. In the days before computers, I even paid a typist to prepare a first and a final draft. And on the plus side, the thesis was later accepted for publication as a book. There may even be a copy buried in the AU library. Okay, that's much better. All right. And so then my friends began referring to me as the bomb lady. So with my diploma and resume in hand, I headed to Washington, D.C., hoping to get a job on Capitol Hill. But little did I know that with no experience, no connections, almost no one was interested in talking to me at that time. I did, however, find a position at a consulting firm analyzing nuclear weapons planning for the Defense Department. After studying at Harvard Law School, Harvard's Kennedy School, and meeting my husband, John, over the milk bar at Lowell House, I landed a spot on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff, working for the powerful chairman, Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia. I wanted to help solve some of the most important international security issues of the day. And during the Cold War, that meant managing nuclear weapons and the Soviet Union. Throughout the Cold War, the most important national security threat we faced was of nuclear annihilation, a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. As a nation, we spent billions to deter a nuclear strike, which we characterized as a low probability, high consequence event. Fortunately, we succeeded and celebrated the end of the Cold War more than 25 years ago when the Berlin Wall fell. Little did we know that other, perhaps more insidious threats would also loom on the horizon. The fall of the Berlin Wall opened new opportunities for the country and for me to reevaluate national priorities. Without the omnipresent threat of the Soviet Union, now it's come back today, we thought about other risks on the horizon. The end of the Cold War followed an environmental awakening in the US so that Americans were expecting healthier air, cleaner water, less contamination of their children. As it became increasingly clear that Cold War military activities had left quite an environmental footprint, a new focus arose on what we called environmental security. I had the opportunity to serve as the Department of Defense's first chief environmental officer in a position called Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, Environmental Security. When this position was created in 1993, I was both the first incumbent, following Paul's era, and one of the few senior female defense officials of the time. I got accustomed to often being the only woman in the room. Occasionally, we would gather women senior appointees at the Pentagon and could barely fill a table at the executive dining room. In that era, the current Deputy Secretary of Defense, #2, Kath Hicks, was an intern working there. So you see it's possible. As the Pentagon's point person on environment, safety, and occupational health, I inherited the environmental challenges of a large industrial organization coming to grips with its environmental stewardship responsibilities, from cleanup of Superfund sites to protection of endangered species. We were also using the emerging environmental capabilities of the US military to constructively shape the future. For example, as we made progress denuclearizing parts of the former Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War, the Russians were also dumping decommissioned nuclear submarine reactors into the ocean. It's hard to imagine today, in the midst of Putin's horrendous war in Ukraine, but at the end of the Cold War, the US was actively engaged in helping denuclearize the former Soviet Union. At the request of the US and Norwegian Secretaries of Defense, I created and led a program on Arctic military environmental cooperation with Russia, Norway, and the US that helped to reduce and safely offload liquid waste streams from sinking Russian subs near the Norwegian border. We also cleaned up scores of contaminated sites at US bases, ensured our troops had clean water and well-conserved training ranges. I'm especially proud that during the 1990s, our military went from being seen as an environmental laggard to being recognized as an environmental and clean energy leader, and come to realize that doing so was also good for the military mission, a win-win situation. Now, Secretary Ignatius Paul shared with me some of his own stories of defense environmental stewardship during the 1960s, protecting the Aldabra giant tortoise, whose home in the Seychelles was being considered for a US military outpost. Instead, the US military chose Diego Garcia, now a strategic resupply location in the Indian Ocean, today also threatened by sea level rise from climate change. With the track record of environmental security well established in the Pentagon, I left in 2001, just before my third child was born. I joined a national security think tank called the Center for Naval Analysis, which Paul is undoubtedly familiar, and my dear colleague, Dr. Ron Philadelphia, was here. Here I was able to spend time thinking again about the evolving nature of our nation's national security priorities. After 9/11, in the midst of the war on terror, the Patriot Act, creation of the Department of Homeland Security, there were still other risks receiving less attention, such as climate change. At the Department of Defense, I'd heavily relied on the leadership of America's generals and admirals to help advance environmental stewardship within the military. So who better to think through the national security implications of an emerging threat such as climate change than our nation's top military leaders? I brought together a dozen recently retired 3- and 4-star generals and admirals to join me on a journey which led to the creation of the Military Advisory Board at the Center for Naval Analysis. I asked the MAB, as it was called, to examine the connection between climate change and national security. Of course, they had a lot of help from Dr. Philadelphia. Many of the generals and admirals were initially skeptical of the link between climate and security, but agreed that it was at least worth examining the risk. Military leaders are trained to examine a range of estimates about weapons, about an adversary, for example, and to prepare plans to reduce that risk in the first instance or defend or deter it. After a year of study, meeting with many leading climate scientists, as well as national security experts, we released National Security and the Threat of Climate Change in 2007, in which we stated the potential consequences of climate change are so significant that the prudent course of action is to begin now to assess how these changes may affect our national security and what courses of action our nation should take. We observed that climate change acts as a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world, making existing threats worse. Furthermore, we concluded that climate change creates risks even closer to home. The demand for disaster relief operations in response to extreme weather here in the US, from deadly hurricanes in the east to damaging wildfires in the west, also affects military readiness and budgets. The lessons from the CNA Military Advisory Board are similar to how we manage nuclear weapons and other strategic risks. In the words of General Sullivan, who may be listening today, former Army Chief of Staff and first chairman of the Military Advisory Board, we can't wait for 100% certainty. If we do, something bad will happen on the battlefield. We spend a lot of time and money preparing for and deterring nuclear risks. We now apply those risk management concepts emerging to climate risks. When we sat down in 2007 and asked ourselves, what are the big risks associated with climate change and how bad could it get? We didn't know for certain what would manifest over a decade later. So what have we seen in the last decade or more? More frequent and destructive storms, floods that overwhelm coastal communities, whether in the US, the Caribbean, South Asia, regular sunny day flooding at key coastal installations such as Norfolk, the largest naval base in the world, deep and persistent drought in Africa and the Middle East that worsens situation of food and water insecurity and provides conditions conducive for violent extremist groups like Boko Haram and ISIS to take advantage of vulnerable populations. Rapid warming and melting of sea ice has opened a new ocean in the Arctic, where the ice is retreating to such an extent that tourists and transports are now regular occurrences in the still dangerous and fragile region. The Arctic is warming at more than twice the rate of the rest of the planet. Indeed, climate change has brought geopolitics back into this region in a way that China, Russia, the US, and others all see future opportunity in the resources and riches being made available by the melting ice. The biggest shift in global commerce since the opening of the Suez Canal will be an ice-free Arctic, where Iceland becomes the new Singapore and China's polar Silk Road stretches from Beijing across the pole down towards markets in Europe. For most of our lifetimes, all major trade routes in the world, think the Straits of Hormuz or Malacca, have been guaranteed by the presence of the United States Navy. Do we think the opening of a critical global choke point, such as the Bering Strait between the US and Russia, will not require US naval presence? China's quest for resources and influence in the Arctic bears watching as well, as do the changing, of course, geopolitics with Russia, sinking permafrost, and the risk of an accident from increased ship traffic or an oil spill that will make the Exxon Valdez look like it was easy to contain. The changes in the melting north are also having a direct impact on the military. Let's consider how not accounting for climate change is affecting our forces today. During my time at the Department of Defense, we knew there were challenges to maintaining military infrastructure, but we were not yet actively planning for rising tides, storm surge, and coastal inundation. Today, many of our key military bases are already at risk of being compromised by sea level rise, from the major naval bases at Norfolk, Virginia, to a $1 billion space fence for tracking space radar at Kwajalein Atoll in the Pacific. In fact, when the Secretary of the Navy was asked by Congress in 2018 why the Navy is developing a new Arctic strategy, he simply replied, "The damn thing melted." Though risks to the military are real, it's also important not to overlook the many Alaska and other villages that will need to be relocated at great expense and human toll. Indeed, some are already being moved. The Army Corps of Engineers has helped the Alaskan village of Newtok move 9 miles upriver to escape the erosion and flooding that destroyed their town dock and water supply. They are some of our nation's first people to be internally displaced by climate change, forced to flee and relocate due to changing conditions. This scenario of the changing geopolitics of the Arctic, direct impacts on military readiness and human displacement, is a look at simply one dot on the global map. But you could do the same assessment for almost any place on Earth today. The geostrategic landscape has already been changed by climate. Today, Ukrainian refugees are the world's most pressing humanitarian need, and we should be doing everything we can to help the people of Ukraine save their lives and their country. The Ukrainian crisis adds an even more immediate dimension to the growing global refugee crisis. We should also understand how climate and ecological security risks are connected to the current Ukraine crisis. While climate stress was not the catalyst for this conflict, climate change is shaping how it unfolds from the strategic to the tactical level. That is why it's important to view every conflict and flashpoint in the world today through a climate lens to ensure we appreciate the direct and indirect consequences of climate stress. My colleagues and I at the Center for Climate Security have helped to lay out the ways in which the climate crisis, the climate and ecological security are linked to the Ukraine crisis. 4 ways: the need to accelerate the energy transition. Second, harm to Ukrainian ecological security. Third, decreasing global food security. And finally, Russia's own climate vulnerabilities. Let's take dive a little deeper on each one. First, let's remember that Senator McCain once referred to Putin's Russia as a gas station with nuclear weapons. One of Putin's most powerful weapons in this war is his production of fossil fuels.
Last year, the EU imported over 40% of its natural gas from Russia. That's why one of the West's most powerful counterattacks is neutralizing this weapon by accelerating the global transition to clean energy. Decarbonizing is also critical to reduce the long-term catastrophic security risks of climate change. Thus, efforts to replace Russian oil and gas to Europe in the short term should not slow down our efforts to decarbonize our energy future. And yes, we will need more gas for Europe in the near term, but we should not lose sight of the climate future we need in just a few short years. That's not to say transitioning from oil and gas is easier or comes without its own risks. One challenge of the energy transition is securing access to the critical minerals required for energy production on a large scale. Russia plays a significant role in producing critical minerals such as copper, nickel, platinum. Ukraine is a key source of gallium and germanium used in solar panels, and it's estimated to have much untapped lithium reserve used in production of electric vehicle batteries. The U.S. now is focused on securing resilient supply chains and announced recently new investments in sustainable domestic supply chains for the materials required for technologies like motors and wind turbines, electric vehicles, and metals for battery storage. The second ecological issue in the Ukraine crisis is the potential radioactive and hazardous release from nuclear power plants or other deliberate chemical attacks by Putin's forces, or release of methane from attacks on pipelines. Russia's occupation of the closed Chernobyl nuclear power plant led to recorded radiation increases of over 20 times their normal levels as heavy machinery dislodged contaminated soil in the exclusion zone. Additionally, Russian forces have attempted to seize the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant after an initial attack which caused fire to break out. At both Chernobyl and Zaporizhzhia, reports indicate that Ukrainian employees had to operate the plants under duress, a very dangerous situation. Third, and not as well understood, is how the Ukraine crisis is leading already to a food crisis in key wheat importing countries across the Middle East and North Africa. With global food prices already hitting record highs this year, the conflict in Ukraine will further disrupt global food supply. Together, Russia and Ukraine account for 1/3 of global wheat exports, 1/5 of maize exports, and 80% of sunflower oil production. Much of Ukraine's harvest and products from Russia, including fertilizer, will be harder to secure, likely resulting in widespread food insecurity and disruptions to the global growing season. The loss of Ukrainian wheat for emerging economies, especially those with fragile democracies, risk instability as rising prices for basic resources and could spark discontent of the type that led to the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011 that began with a food crisis. The bottom line is that climate threat multipliers such as drought and desertification have compromised the resilience of the global food system. Taking Ukrainian and Russian food off the global market will soon lead to empty grocery shelves in fragile states like Egypt and Lebanon. Finally, we should not forget that Russia has its own climate security vulnerabilities, and Putin likely wants to distract domestic attention away from the problem he's unable or unwilling to address. At a press conference in January, President Biden noted that one of the challenges Putin is facing is a burning tundra that will not freeze again naturally. President Biden was referring to the climate insecurities within Russia itself. Russia's temperatures are increasing 2.5 times average global warming, and Putin himself has acknowledged that permafrost melt could be disastrous to northern cities. The recent International Panel on Climate Change report underscored this risk, noting that 85% of large settlements on permafrost worldwide are in Russian territory. And the report said that the ability of foundations to support structures has decreased by as much as 40% relative to the 1960s in the majority of settlements on permafrost in Russia, and are further expected to decrease. At the same time, Arctic ice melt eliminates a natural defense of Russia's northern borders, which could spur increased military buildup. As climate risks go unaddressed in Russia, they pose serious threats to the Russian economy that add to the woes the Russian people are already facing today. When it comes to preventing climate risk, Russia lags behind much of the world in responding to the climate crisis. Ultimately, like other countries around the world, Russia's long-term security is dependent on leaders that can move beyond a narrow perspective on climate risk, all countries, and instead invest in preparing for and preventing climate impacts in partnership with others. Yet Russia's invasion of Ukraine makes cooperation on climate or environmental issues difficult, if not impossible, as illustrated by the decision of the Arctic Council in early March to pause participation by Russia in meetings of the Council or its subsidiary bodies. We have entered a whole new era of disaggregation of international cooperation, unfortunately. This brings me to the last topic I want to address today. It ties together all the experiences of my life, from my family's escape from the Holocaust to reducing nuclear risk from Russia to taking on the threat of a changing climate. And that's the responsibility to prepare and prevent. What does this mean? It's a concept developed by the Center for Climate and Security, where I am the board chair, and first presented to the UN Security Council in 2017. It's about what Nancy championed, mainstreaming environmental prevention, in this case, into our security strategies. These concepts are also reflected in President Biden's climate security executive orders. The idea is that though we are facing unprecedented risks, such as climate change, we also possess unprecedented foresight. The tools and methods for anticipating these risks and doing something about it have dramatically improved over the past decades. And in that context, we have no excuses. We can see these unprecedented threats coming, and that creates a responsibility to act and act preventively. First, let's tackle unprecedented risks. Many of the changes we're seeing today, from climate change to the rate of demographic, technological change, to the destruction occurring in Ukraine today, are unprecedented. On the climate front, the last time there was 410 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, as there was on average recently, humans were not around. For scale, when I entered college, there was 334 parts per million of CO2 compared to 418 today. Global population was 4.3 billion compared to 7.8 billion. So my generation's witness to the beginning of these changes, but today's students, you who are listening, you're witness on an even greater scale. These unprecedented risks to the climate arrived during a time of other critical global changes, most urgent of which is, of course, today's crisis in Ukraine. But let's not forget that population growth combined with the rise of the global middle class in densely populated megacities are the major demographic trend of this century. Climate change, corruption, terrorism, weapons of mass destruction, violent extremist organizations, cyber threats are rapidly escalating the scale and complexity of risks to international security. Combined, many argue these forces have ushered in this new age of autocrats led by Putin, and reminiscent of World War II, when the rise of fascism in Europe was fueled by populist unrest and economic dislocation. This presents a dizzying picture of unprecedented change that's hard to comprehend, never mind manage. But the reality is that in the face of these unprecedented, complex, high consequence risks, we do also have unprecedented foresight. Technological developments are increasing our capacity to foresee, predict, plan, and begin to mitigate these risks. The physical, social, and economic trends of our world can be better modeled and anticipated than ever before. Quantum computing, artificial intelligence, other technologies are now able to process information and data, including weather and demographic data, at an unprecedented scale. These tools will make it possible for us to accurately predict how storms, floods, and droughts are changing in specific regions, and better foresee the risks from food scarcity to water shortages. Used effectively, these tools can help us get out ahead of and prepare for some of the greatest risks. The question is, do we have the political will to use the tools we can create, both technologically and through institution and ultimately environmental peace building? So what does this prepare and prevent really mean? Though we can see the future more clearly now, what exactly can we do to prepare for it? The war in Ukraine offers us a lesson in this regard. First, we can either be paralyzed by this event or learn from it in order to create a more secure and just world. Putin's aggression against Ukraine is the last gasp of a petro-dictator who knows his power will decline as the world moves off fossil fuels, and that critical part of the Russian economy becomes a stranded asset. He's acting now while Europe is still tethered to Russian natural gas. Yet the war in Ukraine has already prompted actions deemed unthinkable just a few months ago, from Germany increasing its defense budget and sending lethal assistance to Ukraine, to the Swiss banning Russian rubles from their accounts. That these previously unthinkable acts occurred so quickly should give us hope for addressing the climate crisis. President Biden should move full, clean steam ahead with his climate agenda that will wean the world off fossil fuels and build resilient supply chains and communities that can better cope with a warming world. This will have the effect of both preparing us for the security risks of climate change, preventing the worst effects, and severing overdependence on fossil fuels that give power and leverage to authoritarians like Putin. Second, there are a lot of other practical things we can do. Here are a few examples that invoke our responsibility to prepare and prevent by utilizing advanced predictive capabilities and unprecedented foresight. Let's take one of the three main climate tipping points in the recent IPCC report, that accelerating methane release in the Arctic, both from permafrost thaw and sea ice loss, is changing the Arctic more rapidly than the rest of the planet. Now, a recent study finds that making significant near-term cuts in methane emissions in tandem with flashing carbon emissions could dramatically improve the probability that Arctic sea ice could survive the summertime through 2100. On our current emissions trajectory, a seasonally ice-free Arctic could emerge as soon as the 2030s, further increasing the geopolitical risk of a new contested region. While many countries, including the US, pledged at COP26 to cut global methane emissions by 30% by 2030, this new study predicts with even greater accuracy the benefits of acting today to avert catastrophe tomorrow. My final promising example is about harnessing the urgency of the climate crisis to accelerate the clean energy transition. Nowhere is this more evident than in Project Prosperity, the deal among Israel, Jordan, and the UAE to swap desalinated water from Israel for solar energy from Jordan to help both nations improve their water and energy postures. This deal has been made possible by the Abraham Accords, through which the UAE and other Arab states are now working with Israel. In announcing this deal last November, the Israeli energy minister stated, "This is a message to the whole world about how countries can work together to combat the climate crisis. Israel and Jordan are two countries with different needs and capabilities that can help each other cope with challenges in a greener, cleaner, and more efficient way. Jordan, which has an abundance of open spaces and sunlight, will help advance the state of Israel's transition to green energy and to achieve the ambitious goals we have set. In Israel, which has excellent water desalination technology, will help tackle Jordan's water shortage." Project Prosperity will utilize both advanced predictive capabilities on energy and water and build more stable institutional relationships between Jordan and Israel, supported by the UAE. It is a model of further clean energy and water security for the region. To conclude where I began, we know today that the climate and ecological risks are a core component of international security. I'm deeply grateful that American University is educating the next generation of leaders in this field. More than 60 years ago, President John F. Kennedy spoke to these concepts, stating, "I look forward to a great future for America, a future in which our country will match its military strength with moral restraint, its wealth with our wisdom, its power with our purpose. I look forward to an America which will not be afraid of grace and beauty, which protects the beauty of our natural environment." And to echo President Kennedy's refrain, I look forward to an America which cherishes and promotes both its national security and its environmental security. Thank you.
Come on over, Sherri. Is this working? Yeah, good. Okay, so Sherri, thank you so much. That was a lot to chew on. And that last bit about desalination has also got me thirsty. So there's a lot also to swallow. It's just, it feels like overkill that we have these microphones, but because we both project very well, it seems. And as you know, like having a voice that projects, it certainly helps get your ideas heard. It may not be everything, but it certainly goes a long way. Well, let's come back to something that you really grabbed me with in the very beginning of this, and that is Bomb Lady. Bomb Lady got my attention. I'm sure it got some other people's attention too. And I think it would be interesting for us to know how you traveled from the Bomb Lady of Amherst College all the way through this period in which you were serving in the Senate Armed Services Committee, and then somewhere along the way made this transition into a role at the Pentagon as their environmental security chief. So I know that the discourse was really transforming in the 80s and 90s around just heightening our awareness of risks to the environment. But where personally did this happen for you? How did we get from the Bomb Lady to the one who could comment and coin the term threat multiplier?
Well, I learned environment on the job on the Senate Armed Services Committee staff. During my time there, I was the first female and professional staff member. I was one of the few Yankees on the committee with the Southern staff. Senator Nunn used to say, "Sherri, we're going to teach you how to talk Southern." And I also got the portfolio that as a junior kid that no one else really wanted, which was oversight of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex, because it was the Armed Services Committee. So I had oversight of the nation's national labs. And at the time, in the 1980s, we were still producing fissile material for nuclear weapons. And we had reactors in far-flung places like Hanford and Savannah River, Rocky Flats. We processed plutonium. And when I went to visit it, they looked at me and they said, "Oh, are you of childbearing age? Don't go in that building over there then." So, and within a few months, the FBI was doing an oversight on, potential criminal violations of environment, safety, and health laws. During that time, the 1988 to 1989, the entire nuclear weapons complex facilities failed for environment, safety, and health considerations. It was on the front page of the New York Times, for 3 months. And then the Secretary of Energy also said, "Well, we're awash in plutonium. We don't need to produce any more of this stuff." So those two things combined, like it was the end of the Cold War, we had enough fissile materials, and these plants aren't working very well. So we started doing hearing as the oversight committee. We ran a series of hearings, and then we restructured the energy department to address its environment, safety, and health considerations. So that was how I made the transformation from weapons to waste, as I sometimes say. And then when I left the committee, I practiced law, and some of the law I practiced in that era was environmental law. Superfund brought a lot of cases to practicing attorneys in that era, and that's also where I really got into work on the oceans and with the Navy. One of my clients at the time was the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which is the nation's premier oceanographic research institution, and it was overhauling its oceanographic research vessels, and I was part of the legal team helping them with some contract issues on that. So I got to know Woods Hole, I got to know the Navy and oceanography a little bit, and ocean science. And so that's that's part of the journey there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that backgrounding, because it's, I think all of us can probably relate to a moment when we became acutely aware of the risks to our climate, to our planet, and can trace it to a time or something, some kind of event, a moment. At least that's true for me. But it's interesting to hear how you came around to it. Now, I want to just also take a second here to prime the room for questions, because people in the room will have time to ask Sherri some questions as well. But I have one more question, and that is about just the framing of our conversation about climate change and the risks that climate change poses to us. It seems like a lot of it is really centered on science and economics. And what I'm hearing from you is we need to think about this in relation to national security. Why hasn't this gained more traction, do you think, the way that the framing of it as a national security imperative?
That's a really good question, Robert. And I think there were some who had the motive initially in helping us create the CNA Military Advisory Board to change the national conversation on climate change and to reflect the national security considerations and see it through this prism of a threat multiplier. And I think it has changed the conversation somewhat. I think also, we've been a divided and kind of polarized country on the matter of climate, and then the economic interests in traditional energy production also just are what really determines, I think, how votes are cast, even more so. Though there's been, the military has been out front at addressing climate impacts to its bases, and you see among the most bipartisan support for climate action among members who have military bases in their district, and many of those are in conservative and red states, because no one wants their military base to go away. So they'll do everything to, protect it from sea level rise or drought or wildfire, and protect the troops. Everyone loves to, protects the troops. But as a nation, I think, except in times of crisis like we're in now, where Ukraine is kind of at the front of everybody's conversation, often foreign policy and national security issues are not what drive voters, except in times of crisis. And, we've tried in many ways to elevate this conversation. I think it has been getting more attention, but it deserves even more attention. You're right.
Yeah. All right, I'd like to turn it over to the room now. Is there anyone who'd like to ask a question for our speaker? We have someone over there. Microphone, this one goes there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for sharing your remarks with us. On the question of climate change being considered or not considered so much as a national security issue, do you think that climate change becoming more of a part of the National Security Council's agenda, particularly after the 2018 launch of the climate security mechanism, was helpful in the perception of climate change and policy around it? Or did that not have so much of an effect on the way that we see climate change and national security?
If you're referring to the climate security mechanism in the UN, I think, in my view, that reflects a lot of work that's been done, that we've done through the CNA Military Advisory Board and other organizations leading up to that 2018 decision. Germany, a number of other European countries were real leaders in creating that climate security mechanism at that time. In the Trump administration, the US, of course, was not very involved with that activity. But there's been a lot of work been done on climate and security, climate and security in a even broader context than climate and national security focused on the military, as you know, if you're asking that question. And so I think that's helped to raise attention to this. And what I talked about, the discussion on the responsibility to prepare and prevent, which we presented first in 2017, was kind of the lead up through these area dialogues to creating that climate security mechanism. I think it's helped, certainly the UN Secretary General has put a lot of attention on this. He's championed, the work of the IPCC. He's created venues and opportunities to have more elevated discussion on climate and security. And as new nations come into the Security Council and rotate out, they also are trying to elevate that conversation. So I think it's good. I think it helps. It's an all hands on deck kind of challenge here.
All right, we have a question from a gentleman over here.
Thanks so much for your general comments. I wonder if you could just tick off 3, 4, 5 examples of specific decisions made by the Pentagon in recent years, whether it's on bases or weapon systems or manpower, whatever, that have actually been driven by climate considerations.
Okay, that's a good question. So some of them have been reactive, like when a hurricane tore the roofs off some of the hangars at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida and destroyed the much of the base that houses our F-35. We're now rebuilding that base at a tune of billions of dollars to have strengthened hangars and better infrastructure.
That's smacks of damage repair. I thought from your earlier comments, there was really going to be an impact on decisions looking forward.
Yes, I think that's right. So that is, so in the last, even before that, the Department of Defense has been developing a climate assessment tool that it's now using to screen every military base for climate risks. And then the question is doing that now, hundreds of bases. And the question is whether it's going to then invest in those mitigations, whether it's seawalls, more natural infrastructure, better fire protection. On the energy side, DOD has been a major leader already in renewables. First, it learned, there were less a combination of climate awareness and the challenges of moving energy and water to the front in Afghanistan, in Iraq, where our convoys were put at risk, military troops, drivers were put at risk. We began to change out the way we power forces at the front, using more renewable sources where available, and differently powering remotely operated bases. So the deployment of sort of small renewables. Now, another decision the Department of Defense has recently made is to put a microgrid at every military base within the next 7 years. That's going to be a major investment because that will help both allow for more renewables at a smaller scale at the base and also allow bases to maintain power even if the national electric grid goes out around them. So there are these exercises called Black Start exercises where the military practices maintaining power once the grid goes down. Those are, and also there's a lot of work being done to change out propulsion systems for aircraft and for ship systems to make them more efficient. So there's a whole series of technologies that's focused on efficiency of the weapon system. Renewables, so solar at military bases, also in housing. DOD has some of the largest stock of solar-powered housing in the US. That is both a climate decision, but in the end, it's also an energy efficiency decision, and it also saves costs.
We have time for a quick one. Okay, over here. Thank you.
This will be very quick. Are there any efforts being made to sort of train the enlisted men in this kind of thing? I mean, are there education programs about the environment that the troops participate in?
Oh, there are many now, Paul. And in fact, the Department of Defense in its climate adaptation plan, one of the pillars is to have a climate-ready force and climate-infused decision-making. So now there are efforts to actually bring climate training education, not only at the professional military education level at the war colleges, for example, but actually down to the enlisted level. So how you wash your trucks, for example, where the runoff goes, how much water you use, where the waste goes, better bead blast, better ways of taking paint off aircraft to both reduce emissions and to also use non-toxic paints. I mean, there's a whole variety of training that occurs now at every level.
Can I just ask, because grades are everything here, right? Everybody's on, pins and needles about their grades. If you were to grade DOD and their efforts to cut dependency on fossil fuels and explore renewables wherever possible, what grade would you give them? No inflation.
Well, I'd say the plans that have been put out by this administration are an A, but the execution, we don't yet know. So we don't know, as we say, strategy without budget is hallucination. So the first year or so of this administration has been all about getting out these many plans. And now there are all these documents out there and they say they have all these goals. But now in the next year or two, we'll begin to be able to measure DOD against those goals and see if it can earn a grade. That's very hard because it's going to require significant investment. But there's, hope has to be more than a method.
Yeah, and you have left us feeling rather, somewhat hopeful. It wasn't all dire and doom. Strategy without budget is hallucination. That I'm going to take home with me. Yeah. All right, I think we've reached our end, but do we have another quick one?
One more question?
One more question. Okay, we can take a quickie. There you go.
Hi, Sherri. Thanks for a great talk. And so it's interesting. My career is kind of transected with you in many areas, not only DOD and Navy and cleaning up military installations, but also designing and building the salt waste processing facility. But my question to you is really nuclear power. It seems that, we've given up on potentially looking at alternative sources. We look at renewables and that's great, but obviously that's a big uphill battle for us. And I was intrigued by the UK announcing that they want to build 4 nuclear power plants. And I just wondered why, the United States just can't seem to bring up that discourse again and revisit. After all, the Navy has run nuclear power safely for a long, long time now. So what is it about commercial nuclear power that we just can't go back?
Well, I think we are going forward. Actually, there are substantial investments by the Department of Energy today in the next generation of nuclear power. They call them small modular reactors, even micro reactors. Department of Defense is part of that. It could be, cite some of the first small modular reactors for remote power locations, for example, in Alaska. So that work is underway. You don't hear it in the discourse from this administration as much, but I was at a talk with somebody from DOE's nuclear energy programs, just in the last couple of weeks, and she talked about all the investments they're making, and there's many. There's a number of projects in there. There's TerraPower. There's something that Gates is supporting. There's something at the Idaho National Labs. So there's several projects underway, and the U.S. in the last decade or two has lost sort of global leadership in commercial nuclear power, and so one of the big dangers now is that countries around the world, as they need nuclear power because they need decarbonized baseload energy, they're going to get it from China or Russia instead of from the US. And so we need to be back in that game because we see in Ukraine how dangerous it is. And, we're already talking about sort of replacing Russian fuel, Russian fuel with safer American fuel at other nuclear power plants. So yes, we need to get back in the game. The investments are there. And I think it just somehow it flies under the radar a little bit in a lot of the political discourse, but the work is going on.
Okay, and with that, we're going to have to bring it to a close. But Sherri, I just want to say it's been a real pleasure hearing your insights from your distinguished career in public service, all these great thoughts and ideas, reason for concern, reason for hope, I'd say. So could you all join me in thanking Sherri for being with us today? Thank you again, Paul, for giving us this platform to have Sherri here. And thank you.
That was a terrific paper. I hope you publish it. I think relating these issues of climate to the current situation in Ukraine is really quite brilliant. It should see the light of day.
Yeah, very much tying it to our present circumstances.
Well, thank you. It's a deep honor to be here, and thank you for your leadership, Paul, and for the legacy that Nancy has left all of us.
Thank you. And thank you all for being with us today. That concludes.